Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror and detail. Today we are going to share scary Wendigo horror stories. First story, Wendigo stories. When I was young, I often spent parts of summers with my grandmother in her home out in the country. It was my favorite place in the world, and I always looked forward to the week-long stays of gardening, baking, late-night fires with s'mores and ghost stories, and enjoying having my grandmother all to myself. There was a pond, not far from her house, where I would sometimes go to swim. It was home to quite a few frogs, and at night they made the most incessant noises. I complained to my grandmother only once, saying I couldn't enjoy the night breeze with all that racket. She took me on her lap and told me a story about an old man and woman who lived near a lake. The old man couldn't stand the singing of the frogs, but his wife told him that they kept the Wendigo away, and to harm them would be unwise. Well, he didn't listen and set about methodically catching all the frogs on the lake. It was a process that took some time, but he did not stop until he had rid the lake of the pesky amphibians. That night, without the protection of the frogs, he and his wife were slaughtered by the Wendigo, a vicious, whip-like demon creature with elongated fingers ending in razor-sharp talons and rows of silver teeth as thin and keen as needles. I wrote it off as another of her ghost stories, though she seemed more serious than usual about it. I never complained about the frogs again, mostly because I grew to enjoy them and put the story out of my mind. In fact, I'd forgotten all about it until it came up this past spring in a Native American literature class I was taking in college. The mention of the Wendigo sparked that old memory of my grandmother's story. I thought she had made up the word. I didn't realize there were stories about it, originating in Algonquin legends. Eager to connect something from my childhood to the topic, I Googled it, only to find that my grandmother had apparently been mistaken. There was nothing I could find about the story she had told me, nor any references of frogs providing protection from the Wendigo. In fact, the Wendigo of legend seemed very little like my grandmother's version. They were said to be insatiable, craving human flesh, and sometimes created from the forms of people who had resorted to cannibalism to survive. Descriptions varied, but they sounded almost nothing like my grandmother's bogeyman version. I actually chucked as I read it, almost a bit embarrassed by how badly my grandmother had messed up the original tale. I changed residences this summer, moving to a newly built 1,000 square foot on each side duplex on the edge of town. The other side is to be occupied by my landlady, who'd had the place built. However, she isn't scheduled to move the rest of her stuff in and begin living there for a couple of weeks. She's waiting for her lease to end. Even though my new place is only a few minutes from the edge of town, it feels much more isolated. I enjoy the seclusion of my new home and its proximity to a more natural setting. I'm surrounded by woods, and from my patio, I can even see a pond beyond the carefully landscaped lawn, which is meticulously carved out from the surrounding woodlands. Just like the pond near my grandmother's house, the frogs have put up a ferocious racket lately. I prefer not to pay to run my air conditioning if I can help it, so I have every window open to catch a breeze. That means that I can hear them as clearly as if I were standing on the water's edge. It took a few days to get used to the noise, but I'm fine now, just like I was those summers when I was young. In fact, the noise has been comforting to me during the stress of the move. Tonight is different. I find myself standing in my living room, staring at where the pond is, though I can't see it in the dark. The air is eerily still and oppressively warm, but all my windows are shut, and I feel impossibly cold. I'd long since convinced myself that my grandmother's story had been a silly tale, a twisting of an old legend by irreverent storytellers. But for some reason, I have the most overwhelming sense of dread growing in the pit of my stomach. I don't know what to do. I'm trapped. Leaving my house means braving the darkness beyond my home, but I don't know if I'm going to be safe in here either. The frogs have stopped singing. Second story. I saw something on my way home from work that scared me half to death. I live in Northeast Ohio, and I got a new job about 2 months ago as a process technician at a dairy plant. I pays very good money, considering it's a 35-mile drive one way. After about 20 or 25 miles, I drive through a wooded area. Nothing uncommon for me, as where I live in Indiana, Ohio, forests are common, and I pretty much lived in the one behind my grandma's house growing up. I work 4 p.m. to 4 a.m., and the drive home sucks. Whether it's being tired, hungry, or the fog almost every night, I go the same way every day and night. I was driving my way home. I just left the residential area of my workplace and was going through the forested area. As I said, there's almost fog every night, so I'm on high alert for deer, raccoons, and such critters. It's just like every other drive home so far. I have a podcast on focusing on the road, thinking of getting either a sausage McMuffin or McGriddle from McDonald's, and sometimes looking off to the side of the road for any eyes reflecting off my headlights. All of a sudden, I see some reflecting eyes. Out of the woods comes a coyote. In my hometown, coyotes aren't too rare. I've seen them by my high school, but had never seen one outside of my hometown, so it surprised me. I start slowing down as it crosses the road until it turns to my car and sits in the road. It sat about 10 feet from my car. There had been no cars I had seen since leaving the residential area, so I was going to go around it, but I thought this was too odd of a thing to happen to just drive away from it. I expected it to just get up and walk away at any given second. This is where I began to get very scared. I honk my horn, and after about 2 or 3 seconds, it smiles at me. I have my brights on so I can see it perfectly. This coyote had human-shaped teeth. My heart dropped and every hair on my body raised, just as it is now recalling this incident. It lasted about 1 second before sitting up and running into the woods. I sat there in fear for about 5 seconds before shoving my foot on the pedal and driving at getaway speed. I didn't stop and get food because I had, and still have, no appetite. I thought the rest of the ride home what I saw. Once doubting I saw it, but like I said, with my brights on and it as close to my car as it was, I saw it as clear as day. This coyote had human teeth, and there was no doubt about it. I'm very into the paranormal, and that includes cryptids. Is it possible I ran into a skinwalker or some genetically mutated coyote? I am Native American if that counts for anything. It's so weird typing this out, but I'd like someone who knew more about these things to help out if they can. I know one thing though, and that's I'm finding a new way to work. Third story. Weird creature spotted in Minnesota. Hello, everyone. I'm reaching out because of an event that happened last night. I need help figuring out what my mother and I saw. I moved to Minnesota about 6 months ago. It's a pretty cold state. More or less, I love it here. It's very peaceful, and when it snows, it's really beautiful. However, my image of Minnesota was changed last night. Me, my mom, and my stepfather were all sitting down watching a movie in the living room. As the movie was about to end, we paused it because my mom wanted to go smoke, and I had to use the restroom. Once I'm back from using the restroom, I go and sit down with my stepdad. A few seconds later, my mom opens the patio door and yells for us to get out there. We rush outside, and she tells us that she started hearing the noise of something big walking in the snow. When she started to look around for where the noise was coming from, about 40 feet away was a white trailer. She said that when she looked over there, she saw something with red eyes staring at her. She said that it looked like a really big dog. At first, my stepdad said that it was probably a coyote. Then I started to think on how my mom heard a coyote walking in the snow 40 or 50 feet away. I realized that it had to have been something very big. I've always been one to believe in paranormal things. My mother, not so much. We look around for a bit longer, then we go back inside. A few hours later, I leave my room to go grab a soda, so I can continue playing Halo. After the whole event, I've had this unshakable feeling. So I decided to just look outside to reassure myself that she was seeing things. As my eyes scan the edge of the woods, I don't really see anything. I take a deep breath and I grab the soda and close the fridge. As I close the door, I glimpse out the window and freeze. Sure enough, I see a pair of red eyes peering at me through the trees. I couldn't see much because of how dark it was. It was around 3 a.m., but I know what I saw. I saw something that I've never seen before. Those red eyes went right through me. Then as quick as I had seen them, they disappear. What did I see? Fourth story. Our bizarre experiences with the forest behind our house eventually forced us to move out. I was 8 years old when we first moved into the house on the edge of the forest. My parents had their doubts about buying a house with a backyard bordered by forest. They had concerns about wild animals getting into our bins or hurting our dogs, and were worried one of us might go too far into the trees and get lost. But it was cheap. My dad liked the seclusion, my mom loved the house itself, and my siblings and I were excited about playing in the backyard and exploring the forest. Our first sign that something wasn't right was that our dogs were absolutely terrified of the forest. They never went into the forest for any reason. If a toy they'd been playing with found its way past the tree line, they would refuse to retrieve it, and when one of us went in, they would pace anxiously until we returned. On occasion, we'd notice the dogs staring at a spot in the forest in obvious distress, sometimes growling or barking, but we could never see anything there. My brother once carried one of the dogs into the trees to show her there was nothing scary about it, but she wriggled out of his grip and sprinted into the house in a panic. If we were in the backyard when it was getting dark, we sometimes heard noises like someone was walking through the forest, sticks crunching underfoot, branches being pushed aside. If we called out, there was no response, but if we shined a flashlight around, we would occasionally catch a glimpse for just a split second of something that we could swear looked like a person walking around in the dark. My parents quickly banned us from entering the forest at all after dark, and even during the day, we weren't allowed to go out of sight of the house. My sister's bedroom window looked out at the backyard and the forest beyond, and she remembers looking out her window one night and seeing a shadowy figure standing right at the edge of the backyard. She says there was something wrong with it, like it wasn't quite standing on the ground, and it was a little too tall to be a person, and it was sort of distorted, and she was convinced it was staring at her. She called for our dad, saying there was a man in the yard staring through her window, and when he ran outside to chase off whoever it was, she continued to watch the figure. It didn't move away, but when the light from our dad's flashlight passed over it, it suddenly just wasn't there anymore. We regularly heard knocking at the back door at night, with no one there. Our parents thought it was teenagers playing pranks, and stopped bothering even opening the door, until one rainy night when the knocking was persistent and agitated. My mom pointed out there might be someone needing shelter from the heavy rain outside, but when she opened the door, not only was there no one there, but there were no wet footprints on the porch. The knocking continued the whole time we lived there. It would happen several times in the span of a few weeks, then stop for months, then start up again. My parents eventually installed a security camera, and there was never anyone at the door. The camera wasn't all useless, though. About 3 years into living there, my brother started having night terrors and sleepwalking. When he went sleepwalking, he would always go out the back door and start walking towards the forest. My mom, being a light sleeper, would hear the door open and would run out to get him before he made it into the forest. After the third or fourth time it happened, my brother asked to see the camera footage because he wanted to see how he looked when sleepwalking, I guess thinking it'd look funny. The footage showed him walking out onto the porch, then pausing as if listening to something, and shaking his head, then reluctantly walking forward as if being pulled or forcefully guided by something. One evening my dad was in the backyard, and he heard my sister calling him from the forest, seemingly in distress. Thinking she'd gone exploring in the forest and fallen over and hurt herself, he ran in and started calling to her, but quickly realized it was too dark to see her, and he couldn't pinpoint where her voice was coming from. He told her to wait where she was while he grabbed a flashlight. When he ran back into the house for the flashlight, he saw my sister inside, safe and completely unconcerned. At the time, my dad hadn't told us about hearing my sister's voice in the forest. So when I heard my mom's voice coming from the forest months later, while I was outside with the dogs one evening, I didn't question it despite the fact I'd seen my mom inside recently and hadn't noticed her walk past me. My mom was calling to me, saying she'd gotten her sweater caught in some branches and needed me to come in and help her. As I walked in, the dogs started barking, alerting my dad, who saw me through the window wandering into the forest. He came outside and called to me, and I said I was just helping Mom. He yelled back that Mom was inside, and I needed to run back to the house as fast as I could, which I did. After this, my parents had a fence built around the backyard and started looking for a new place. In the time between the fence being built and us moving out, it got way worse. We'd hear knocking at the door more regularly, as well as tapping on the windows, as if someone was walking the perimeter of the house and trying every window. We would often hear scratching and scraping sounds on the fence and voices beyond it. My brother's night terrors got more frequent, and one night my mom didn't hear the door open when he went sleepwalking, and he woke up standing at the fence, staring into the forest with the dogs barking at him. The last morning we spent there, less than 4 years after we moved in, we woke up to find the back door fully open, and the security camera footage showed it slowly swing open on its own. Since moving out, my brother's sleepwalking has stopped, though he still gets night terrors and he suffers from pretty severe anxiety. A few nights ago, he called me out of the blue, and after a bit of small talk, he asked me if I think the door being open that final night means whatever was out there finally got in. He was trying to make light of it, saying he was getting into the spirit of Halloween, joking about how maybe we should all get exorcised just in case something latched onto us all those years ago. But I think he's deeply bothered by everything that happened. I know I still am a little. I still get nervous around dark wooded areas. I don't know what I think was out there in the forest behind our house at night, but I get the feeling that given the chance, it would have swallowed us whole. Fifth story. Has anyone seen this creature too? I've done many Google searches and have found nothing like it. I have only spoken to a few close friends about this experience, and my parents don't quite believe me. When I was about 12 years old, me, my 2 younger brothers, and my 2 younger cousins were playing outside at night. Our cousins came over to see us, and all of the adults were inside the home. We lived in a small trailer park in Texas at the time, and it was built either on top of or near indigenous land. We played outside a lot at the time, and there was a street light that shone over the part of the road we were playing on, so it didn't feel so creepy. I looked down the road where a white house sat, and next to it was a garage, and next to that was the forest. There was a lot of forest in the area. And I saw something coming out of the forest. I thought it was a wolf for a brief moment. Then I felt my heart sink when I saw its distorted-looking, long, thin limbs, and the uncanny way it moved brought tears to my eyes. It had a long head and a small mouth, like a horse, tan in color, and was extremely thin, and had no tail. I grabbed my cousins and told them to look where I was pointing and asked if they could see it too, or if I was crazy. They had a terrified look on their faces and said, yes, and I looked over at where I saw the creature, and it got up and started walking on its 2 hind legs and moved in such a freaky way. It began to climb the garage with ease. This thing had to have been around 8 to 10 feet tall while standing on its back legs. I then ordered everyone to run inside. I told the adults what we saw, and they didn't believe us for whatever reason. I assumed they thought it was our imaginations. Anyways, I haven't seen those cousins since the encounter due to family issues. I have searched the internet many times trying to find a sighting report or image that resembles this creature, to which I have had no luck finding. Sixth story. Possible Wendigo encounter. Hey everyone, not sure if this is the right place to post this, but I'm definitely spooked. Also my very first Reddit post. So sorry if it's a little jumbled. So today my friend, let's call her Ray, and I were in my car at night, windows rolled down and screaming our heads off to loud music. We were feeling absolutely happy, laughing, and having a great time overall while driving around the rich neighborhoods looking at huge mansions. Now, here comes what spooked us majorly. We start getting a little put off because of how dark this road was. Plus, we were going into the middle of a forested area, and everything around us was getting darker and darker. I had to turn on the brights on my car. Now, we still didn't say anything to each other seriously, only joking about being a little nervous and getting weird vibes. I make the mistake of turning down a forked road, and immediately we feel sick to our stomachs, both at the same time. I just looked at her, and we both started saying about how something is not right. It was such an urgent feeling of terror, dread, knowing something terrible was going to happen if we stopped the car. We felt like we had to roll the windows up because we wanted to be safer. Once we finally sped back around and started leaving, I felt an intense feeling of something watching us, and I just could not make myself turn to look to my side into the forest or behind us. The second we got off that road, it felt like a weight came off our shoulders, again at the same time. I've never felt this terrified before, with such a huge pit in my stomach and sense of dread. What was that? Seriously, I have no idea what happened or why we started feeling that way suddenly. I'm so scared, even just thinking about it gives me goosebumps all over. Has anyone else experienced something like this? Or do you know what it might have been? 7th story. The Wendigo story. A few years ago, 2012 or 2013, I think since I was still in high school then, I was at a party with some friends, and as the night goes on, maybe 11 to 12 at night, one of my friends and I go outside to have a cigarette. The second we get outside, there's just this completely awful, foul smell. Like just blood, vomit, piss, and death all at once. Now, this was somewhat the middle of nowhere, so we just figured it was a dead animal and went on with having that cigarette. Less than a minute later, we hear something moving in the dark, and sure enough, a deer comes hobbling into the very edge of the porch light. So we just mention how cute and the like. But then I noticed something, one of its front legs was messed up in some way. And I'm talking like broken in multiple places, messed up. So my friend and I are slightly off-put by this, less than we should have been since drunk, and finish up our cig and go to head inside. However, right as we start to do that, one of the two porch lights goes pop and goes out. So now it's less light outside, and this deer is back into the darkness. So, a bit giddily, we both do this like fake scared squeal at each other and turn around to go inside. And that's when we heard it. That undeniable sound of nails on the concrete patio. We both slowly turn around to see this hunched over, rotten coyote doing this very slow, very unnatural crawl towards us. We go from 600 paralyzed with fear almost instantly until another one of our friends playfully pulls us through the open door telling us to get back to the party. To this day, I have not experienced anything like that, and it's one of the most horrifying things I've ever experienced. 8th story. Help, I've lived in Appalachia all my life, and this weekend I saw something I can't explain. For the past 18 years, not including 3 years in college, I've lived in a remote part of the Appalachians. Cell phone service is virtually non-existent at my house, and using the internet requires a 30-minute trip to the local library. Despite the isolation of the area, I've always considered it a tranquil and safe place to call home. With so few people around, there's nobody to commit crimes in the first place. Home is a vast expanse of rolling greenery, which in the fall becomes a wild display of reds, oranges, and yellows, like the embers of a slowly dying campfire. I never could have comprehended the primal terror that this breathtaking landscape could conceal until last night. As a senior pre-med student, I've got a busy schedule, endless hours of labs and class, followed by nerve-wracking evenings spent trying to be accepted somewhere, string out my nerves to their last fiber. When I saw an opening in my calendar, I felt compelled to return to the primal beauty that nurtured my nascent mind. Thankfully, my lovely girlfriend of 2 years also had an open weekend, so I felt a surge of excitement at the prospect of sharing my home with her. We meandered our way to the mountains late Friday afternoon with our windows down, bathing ourselves in the crisp fall air. After about an hour of driving, the mountain I call home came into view. As one of the largest in our area, its gently sloping base culminated in a rocky backbone which snaked its way into the distance. I shifted my car into four-wheel drive, and we began the long crawl up the rocky trail that can be loosely termed my driveway. We meandered gradually through the depths of the forest until my house came into view. More specifically, my guest house. Located about a quarter-mile from my main home, the guest house is the home we keep spotlessly clean for company, a stark comparison to our more cluttery main home. A gentle rain fell which accented the sweet, earthy smell of the forest as we brought our bags inside. My parents greeted us, and we enjoyed a brief home-cooked dinner with plenty of small talk and laughs. Around midnight, my parents let us be, and we made ourselves cozy. A city girl her whole life, my girlfriend is fascinated by the outdoors and animals. More specifically, she loves listening to the mournful howls of coyotes. Naturally, being a mountain man, I long ago mastered the art of screeching out realistic howls and barks. On most nights, I can easily lure some lonely pack of coyotes to respond back. We huddled around my bedroom window, and I let out a few howls. My girlfriend winced at the loudness and ridiculousness of my efforts, and we waited for a response. Nothing. I tried again, and nothing but the echo of my own voice responded. Maybe it's too cold, I thought. On a cold, rainy night, the coyotes are probably huddled inside their caves and crevices, trying to sleep away the rough weather. Suddenly, something answered my howls. Coyotes can make some strange sounds, but this was different. A shriek echoed up the hollows, almost human-sounding, but too high-pitched and piercing in tone to be produced by a human larynx. What I gasped. My girlfriend hopped up in fright. "What was that?" she asked in a nervous voice. "Bobcat, maybe," I replied. I howled once more and waited. Again the shriek split the cold, foggy air of the forest, though this time much closer. I reached for my flashlight and shone a beam of pale LED light through the depths of the mist-filled air. I swung the beam around searching, and just at the edge of the beam, I saw something unimaginable. As a keen student of biology, I have a broad knowledge of vertebrates and invertebrates, and this was something different. It stood on two legs covered in patchy hair that culminated in cloven feet like a deer's. Its upper body was almost humanoid, again covered in patchy hair. The skin of its abdomen clung tightly to its exposed ribs and undulating vertebrae. On top of this anorexic-looking frame sat a head that looked at once human and at once animal, with branches of sharp antlers coming out from the back of its head. The beast loped with a supernatural litheness upon its bony legs, and it seemed to be making its way to the porch. "Go upstairs, Anna," I said with a faltering voice. Anna sprinted out of the room and up the stairs while I grabbed my trusty shotgun. I made my way to the living room, which attached to the porch, and shined my light through the window on the door. My beam was met with eyes that would scare the soul from your body. The eyes were empty and pale like those of an aged hound with cataracts, but they were alive with a sort of ancient energy, and they gazed straight through my terrified, adrenaline-soaked brain. The walls of the house reverberated with a deafening explosion as I began unloading my shotgun on the door, and my flashlight fell to the floor. It seemed almost sacrilegious to be shooting at those eyes, but they stared at me with such a demonic and otherworldly aspect that I could not begin to understand their motives. Screams punctuated the roar of my 12-gauge thunder, screams from both the beast and my traumatized partner hiding upstairs. The eyes vanished in the hail of 00 lead that I unleashed. Silence came as abruptly as the roar of the shotgun had moments before, and I frantically called my parents from the home phone. "Some night you had," my dad chuckled in the morning. "Yeah, never seen a bear that close to the house," I squeaked out. "Kinda pissed about the door, but a bear like that can't be left alone. Sorry, poor Anna is too scared to stay the rest of the weekend, my dad said, still jovial. We're back at school, and I have no idea what to do. My parents would think I was crazy if I told them the truth behind this weekend, but I can't leave them there with that thing. Something that paranormal doesn't seem as though it would die at the volley of a shotgun. Maybe posting this on Reddit will help me clear my mind and figure out how to deal with this. Ninth story. My boyfriend is telling me to come outside. He isn't there. My boyfriend works late hours, and when I know he's on his way to my house, I'll sit and wait for him in the kitchen to greet him. The main door is in front of me while the back porch one is behind me. He tends to come through that one so my dog doesn't bark. He called me a few minutes ago and said he just left work and he's on his way. So I did my normal and sat at the kitchen table scrolling on my phone until I got them outside text. After a few minutes of scrolling, I heard his voice. The only light outside of my house was the porch light, so I look out of the kitchen window and nobody's there. Baby, come outside. Normally his voice is reassuring and welcoming, but I had a terrible feeling and decided to call his cell phone. His phone is a track phone that he buys service for, so sometimes it simply rings twice, which is what it did. Every time I called, eventually I gave up and stepped into the back porch to look outside. Maybe his phone died and he needed me to unlock the door for him. I could feel my heart drop when I remembered the door was unlocked. I started to text him asking him to answer his phone, but while I'm doing this, the voice turns from a gentle tone to an angry one. It yelled my full name and told me to come outside. My boyfriend never calls me by my full name, and at this point I'm starting to feel scared. I looked outside, and it now knows that I'm not in the kitchen and that I looked out of the back porch window. I call him again. After what felt like hours, he answered in a concerned way, apologizing because his phone was on vibrate, as well as it not working. Why are you telling me to come outside? Those were the first words I said. There was an immediate silence over the line. What do you mean? I'm just now on your road. He sounded worried, but I could tell he thought I was pranking him. The voice was getting angrier by the second. It cussed at me and eventually started banging on the door. It was so loud that even my boyfriend could hear it through the phone. I heard the car speed up, then the sound of gravel from him pulling into my driveway. I finally mustered up the courage to move the curtain and see if there was really anyone there. There was nothing there, but I could see him running up the stairs to get to me. Once he got in, the voice and the banging came to a complete stop. I stood shaken while he looked around my yard, only to see a deer running away on its hind legs, just for the front two to hit the ground in front of it as it went into the nearby woods. We didn't sleep much that night, and eventually we plan on moving somewhere that's closer to the city as my house is out of the way from any other people. 10th story. The Wendigo of Algonquin. My name is Derek Shaw. I'm a survivalist, a man with a deep passion for nature and the wilderness. There's something about stripping life down to its basics. No tents, no gadgets, just me, the earth, and what I can pull from it. Over the years, I've spent more nights than I can count under the stars, in forests and mountains where most wouldn't dare tread alone. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened a few months ago. I've tried to push it out of my mind, tried to bury the memory in the same way I bury my fire pits. But the truth has a way of gnawing at you, like the wind rattling branches in the dead of night. I guess I'm finally ready to tell my story. The story of the most horrific camping encounter of my life. It was in Algonquin, a place I thought I knew well, a place I loved. Now, I'll never look at it the same again. The air was cold enough to sting my lungs with each breath, and the snow crunched under my boots as I trudged deeper into the forest. I'd been to Algonquin countless times, but never here, never this deep into its untouched wilderness. That was the thrill of it. The unknown, a stretch of land where no trails led and no campers had likely ever set foot. I carried just enough gear to get by, a flint, a small hatchet, a few essentials, but the rest, as always, would come from the land. That's how I did things. The trees grew denser the further I went, their branches sagging under the weight of snow. The landscape was quiet, almost too quiet, except for the occasional crack of a branch or the rustle of the wind whipping through the evergreens. It was that stillness, that isolation, that made my heart race in a way nothing else could. This part of the forest was new to me, untouched and wild. I could feel the excitement building as I scanned the terrain for a suitable campsite. After another hour or so of hiking, I found it. A small clearing nestled between two towering spruces, their branches arching above to form a natural canopy. The ground was blanketed in snow, but beneath it, I could make out a rise in the land, an ideal spot for shelter. I dropped my pack and stretched, surveying the space. It was perfect, untouched by human hands. The idea of being the first to camp here, to explore these woods, sent a rush of energy through me. I could already picture the fire crackling in the center of the clearing, my shelter set up against the wind. This would be home, at least for the next few nights. Once the fire was going, the warmth of the flames began to melt the cold that had settled deep in my bones. The light flickered against the snowy backdrop, casting shadows that danced along the treeline. I took a deep breath, savoring the stillness for a moment before getting to work on the shelter. I gathered branches from the nearby trees, testing each one for strength before laying them out in a rough framework. A simple lean-to would do for the night. I layered the branches with smaller brush to insulate against the wind, which had started to pick up. My movements were automatic. This was routine for me by now, but as I worked, something began to feel off. It was subtle at first, just a faint tug at the back of my mind. A strange sense that something was different. I paused for a moment, listening, but all I heard was the crackle of the fire and the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. I shook it off and kept working, telling myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place, the excitement of discovering new territory. But the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it grew stronger with each passing minute. I stood up straight, wiping the sweat from my brow despite the cold, and glanced around the clearing. My eyes scanned the treeline, searching for movement, anything out of the ordinary, but there was nothing, just the quiet, snow-covered woods. And yet, the sensation crept up my spine like a cold hand pressing against the back of my neck. It was irrational, I told myself. I was alone out here. I had to be. But there was something about the way the trees stood, the way the shadows seemed to shift just beyond the fire's reach. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. I'd felt this way before, back in my early days of camping. That unsettling sense of being watched, always lurking just beneath the surface, gnawing at my nerves. I used to chalk it up to my imagination, the natural paranoia of being alone in the wilderness. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, that feeling never fully went away. After getting my camp set up, I decided to head out and forage. I had packed some emergency rations, but I always preferred living off the land, mushrooms, berries, the occasional fish if I got lucky. It was part of the challenge, part of why I loved survivalist camping. As the fire flickered behind me, I grabbed my small foraging sack and made my way into the trees, the snow crunching softly beneath my boots. It wasn't long before I found signs of life, a set of tracks leading off deeper into the forest. At first, I thought they were deer tracks. The pattern was familiar, but as I looked closer, something wasn't quite right. The prints were spaced strangely, almost like they'd been made by something walking on two legs rather than four. I crouched down, examining them more closely. Bipedal, but still shaped like hooves. A chill ran down my spine. I told myself it was silly, that there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. Deer occasionally stand on their hind legs, especially when startled or trying to reach higher branches. It was rare, but not impossible. Still, something about these tracks felt off, unnatural. That's when the thought crept into my mind, the legend of the Wendigo. I had heard the stories before, whispered around campfires late at night. A monstrous creature that roamed the forests, once human, but transformed by a hunger that could never be satisfied. I shook my head, pushing the thought aside. It was ridiculous, I told myself. Just a story, a legend meant to spook children. Still, staring at those tracks, I couldn't help but feel the cold fingers of dread tightening around me. I decided to head back to camp, my mind still buzzing with thoughts of those strange tracks. On my way, I came across a fallen log, and there, clustered near its base, I found a patch of velvet-foot mushrooms, small, brown-capped fungi that thrive even in cold weather. I recognized them immediately. They were edible, and their resilience in these conditions always amazed me. Not much, but enough to complement the winter berries I'd gathered earlier. I carefully plucked a few of the mushrooms and made my way back to the camp, relieved to have found something familiar. Once there, I tossed a few more branches onto the fire, stoking the flames back to life. The crackle and warmth steadied me as I prepared a simple meal, grateful that the wilderness could still provide, even in the dead of winter. After eating, I settled into my shelter, letting the fire's warmth wrap around me as I lay back. The quiet of the forest was soothing, and the flicker of the flames lulled me into a sense of calm. Before long, I drifted off to sleep, but sometime deep into the night, something stirred me awake. At first, I thought it was the wind, but there was a rhythm to the noise, a deliberate crunching sound, something moving slowly just outside the camp. My heart raced as I strained to listen, my breath freezing in the cold air. It wasn't the wind. Something was creeping around the perimeter of my camp, each step slow, calculated. Whatever it was close. I gripped my hunting knife tightly, my fingers tense around the handle as I listened. Whatever it was, it sounded large, but its steps were small, deliberate. It wasn't a bear. I'd encountered bears in the wild before, and they made much more noise, especially when trudging through snow. No, this was something else, something quieter, more cautious. As I strained my ears, trying to make sense of the sounds, a strange, foul odor drifted through the air. It was faint at first, but quickly grew stronger. It smelled of decay, like something rotting, foul, and unnatural. My stomach turned, and I felt a chill creep over me that had nothing to do with the cold. The fire was dying, its light fading fast. I couldn't let it go out, not with something creeping around out there. Slowly, I reached over and grabbed a few pieces of wood, throwing them onto the embers. Sparks flew up, and the fire flickered back to life, casting long, dancing shadows around the trees. I sat up, listening intently, knife in hand, trying to locate the source of the smell and the sounds. But as the wind picked up, the noises began to fade. It was as if whatever had been circling the camp was walking away, its footsteps growing softer and softer until they disappeared completely into the night. For a long time, I just sat there, my senses on high alert, waiting for the sound to return. But all I heard was the wind rustling through the trees. After what felt like an eternity of silence, I finally let myself relax a little, convincing myself that whatever had been there was gone. The rest of the night passed without incident, and despite the unease gnawing at the back of my mind, I eventually drifted off again. The forest remained quiet, almost peaceful, but that lingering sense of something watching me never truly left. The next morning, with the sun shining through the trees and the fire reduced to glowing embers, the events of the previous night felt distant, like a half-remembered dream. The unsettling sounds, the strange smell, all of it seemed like the product of an overactive mind, stirred up by the isolation. I packed up what little I had used and set off to forage again, my focus shifting back to the task at hand. The forest was calm, and the cold air felt refreshing. But as I wandered further from camp, that creeping sense of unease returned. It wasn't anything immediate, no sounds, no movement, just a feeling gnawing at the edge of my awareness. Then I saw them, tracks in the snow. My breath caught in my throat as I crouched down to get a better look. The same hoof tracks from yesterday. The same strange pattern, as though whatever left them was walking on two legs. And they were close. Too close. My camp wasn't more than 100 yards away, and these tracks, they circled it. I stood up, trying to shake off the rising dread. This didn't make sense. I had been sure it was just a deer or some animal, but seeing those tracks again, so close to where I had slept, it was unsettling. My mind raced with possibilities, but I forced myself to stay calm, to keep moving. There was a logical explanation. There had to be. Then, a sharp crack pierced the stillness of the forest. A sound so loud it seemed to echo off the trees. It wasn't the rustling of wind or the snap of a small twig. It was deliberate, heavy like a large branch snapping under the weight of something. I whipped around, my eyes scanning the dense forest where the sound had come from. For a moment, I thought I saw something. A large, hulking figure, just at the edge of the trees, blending into the shadows. My heart pounded in my chest as I squinted, trying to make out any details. But after a few agonizing moments of silence, the figure was gone. Or maybe it had never been there at all. I stood frozen, the tension building in my chest as my mind fought to rationalize what I had seen, or thought I had seen. It had to be my imagination, the shadows playing tricks on me. I hadn't slept well, and the isolation was getting to me. That's all it was. I returned to camp, the strange feeling still clinging to me like a second skin. My mind kept drifting back to those tracks, the heavy snap in the distance, and that brief glimpse of something, if it had been anything at all. I shook it off and focused on gathering wood, deciding to collect more than I needed this time. If nothing else, I wanted the fire to burn strong through the night. As the day dragged on, that sense of being watched never left. It was subtle, like an itch I couldn't scratch, but always there, keeping me on edge. I tried to focus on my tasks, checking the perimeter, stoking the fire, but the unease gnawed at me. When the sun began to sink below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees, I could feel the tension rising again. Night fell quickly, and soon it was time to settle in. The wind had died down, leaving the forest eerily still. My fire crackled in front of me, the soft glow offering some comfort against the darkness pressing in from all sides. I lay down, pulling my sleeping bag tight around me, trying to relax. The fire was strong. The camp was secure. Everything would be fine. But then, deep into the night, I was jolted awake. A sound. No, a scream. It wasn't close, but it was loud enough to cut through the silence like a blade. A screeching wail, distant but piercing. The kind of sound that doesn't belong in the natural world. My heart leapt into my throat, and goosebumps rippled up my arms and neck. I sat up, the knife back in my hand before I realized it. Every muscle in my body was tense, my ears straining to hear anything else. I had heard animals cry out in the night before. Wolves, coyotes, even owls, but this was different. It was a raw, primal sound full of something I couldn't place. Fear, anger, pain? I didn't know. But whatever had made it, I knew one thing for sure. I had never heard anything like it before. It was then that the realization hit me, hard and cold. I was no longer safe. The creature, whatever it was out there. And it was real. The tracks, the strange figure in the shadows, the eerie scream in the night. It had been watching me the whole time, waiting. I didn't know how long it had been lurking, but now, after that scream, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't alone out here. My mind raced, trying to piece together what to do next. My truck was about 5 miles away, parked near the edge of the trailhead where I had started. 5 miles through dense, dark forest with that thing, whatever was out there, stalking me. The thought of escaping, of getting out of these woods, gnawed at me. It was the only thing that made sense, the only chance I had. But then, just as I was starting to gather my thoughts, I heard it. Footsteps. Soft at first, distant but unmistakable. They were slow, deliberate, as if whatever was out there wanted me to hear it coming. My pulse quickened, and my grip on the knife tightened. The sound was getting closer, each step crunching in the snow, growing louder with each second. I sat frozen, staring out into the darkness beyond the glow of the fire, but I couldn't see anything. The flames flickered weakly now, casting shadows that danced against the trees. It was close, closer than it had been last night. My breath hitched as I tried to steady myself, but the pounding in my chest drowned out every rational thought. I wasn't ready for this. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get out of the camp and head for the truck, but my legs wouldn't move. Fear rooted me to the spot, and all I could do was listen as the footsteps grew nearer, the air thick with the smell of decay once again. I had to make a decision. Stay and face whatever was out there, or make a break for it into the unknown darkness. Either way, the creature knew where I was. I had to run. There was no more time to think. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't going to stay out there, circling my camp forever. I needed to get to my truck, back to the safety of civilization. The thought of fleeing surged through me like a bolt of adrenaline, but I knew I had to be smart about it, quiet. I didn't want to alert the creature until I had a head start. I moved quickly, my hands shaking as I tried to pack up my gear. My mind raced, trying to figure out the best route back. The forest was a maze in the dark, but the path wasn't entirely invisible. The snow, coupled with the bright moonlight, reflected enough that I could see through the trees, even if only barely. It was dangerous, but at this point it didn't matter. I'd rather be lost out there than trapped with whatever was stalking me. I grabbed my bag and slung it over my shoulder, keeping my knife gripped tightly in my hand. The weight of the blade was reassuring, even though I wasn't sure it would do me any good. With one last glance at the dying fire, I stepped away from the camp, moving quickly but as quietly as I could. As soon as I was out of the small clearing, the sounds returned. The footsteps. They were behind me again, deliberate and slow, like the thing was pacing itself, just enough to keep up but not enough to attack. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound of it so loud in my ears that it drowned out everything else. I couldn't hear the wind or the crackle of snow under my boots, just my own heartbeat, thundering in my ears like a drum. I walked faster, trying not to break into a full run. Running would make too much noise. I needed to stay calm, but every fiber of my being was screaming at me to sprint, to flee into the darkness as fast as I could. I could feel it just beyond the trees, watching, waiting. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The footsteps were growing louder, keeping pace with me, as if it knew I was trying to escape. I clutched the knife tighter, my knuckles turning white. I had no idea how far I'd gone, or if I was even heading in the right direction. After what felt like an eternity of weaving through the dark forest, the trees finally began to thin out, and suddenly, I stumbled onto the familiar main trail. Relief washed over me for a moment. This was the path that would take me back to my truck. I knew I had to head left, just a few miles to go, and I'd be safe. My legs burned from the cold and the tension, but I forced myself to keep moving, heart still racing in my chest. Then it happened. A scream, louder and more terrifying than the one I had heard earlier, shattered the silence. It wasn't just a sound. It was a visceral, blood-chilling wail that echoed through the trees, reverberating inside my skull. My entire body tensed, and without thinking, I spun around, knife in hand, my eyes scanning the forest behind me. That's when I saw it. Standing in the shadows just beyond the tree line, illuminated faintly by the moonlight filtering through the canopy, was the creature. Tall, emaciated, its skin clinging tightly to its bones, pale as death itself. Its eyes, glowing with a sickly, unnatural light, locked onto me. The creature was skeletal, its body unnaturally thin, and its mouth stretched into a horrific grin, showing rows of jagged teeth. But what struck me most were the horns, massive, twisted antlers protruding from its head, casting long shadows over its sunken, hollowed face. The Wendigo. It was real. It wasn't just some legend, some old story to scare people around the campfire. It was here. It was hunting me. My blood ran cold, and for a moment, I was frozen in place, paralyzed by the sheer terror of what I was seeing. The creature didn't move, but I could feel its hunger, its malice, radiating from it. My heart pounded so loudly, I thought it might burst. This thing, this nightmare made flesh, wasn't going to let me leave the forest. I didn't wait for it to move. I bolted. My legs carried me faster than I thought possible, down the trail, toward my truck, towards safety. But no matter how fast I ran, I could still hear it behind me, the soft, methodical footsteps and the echo of that terrible scream. The Wendigo was coming. The forest blurred around me as I sprinted, my lungs burning with every breath, my legs pumping with a desperation I hadn't known I was capable of. Behind me, the Wendigo was closing in, its footsteps growing louder, faster, more aggressive. I could hear its labored breathing, feel its presence bearing down on me. I was running as fast as I could, but it wasn't enough. It was gaining on me. My heart pounded harder than ever, fear coursing through my veins like fire. I could see the moonlight ahead, the trail narrowing as it bent through the trees. My truck was still too far, but I had no choice. I had to keep going. Every second counted. Then I heard it right behind me, too close. In a moment of pure survival instinct, I spun around, knife in hand, and lunged at the creature. I drove the blade deep into its chest, the point sinking into its pale, skeletal flesh. The Wendigo let out a high-pitched wail of pain, its eyes glowing brighter as it screeched, but my attack barely slowed it down. With one powerful swipe of its long, emaciated arm, it knocked me clean off my feet. I flew through the air, my body tumbling uncontrollably. It felt like I was airborne forever, crashing through the snow and leaves before skidding to a painful stop. I must have flown at least 30 feet, the wind completely knocked out of me. Dazed, I struggled to move, gasping for air, my chest heaving as I tried to regain control. I looked up, my knife still embedded in the creature's chest, but it barely seemed to notice. It stood there, its grotesque form towering over the snow, blood oozing slowly from the wound as it locked its cold, glowing eyes on me. It began walking toward me, slow and deliberate, like a predator toying with its prey. The way it moved was horrifying, its steps almost unnatural, its hunger palpable. I tried to push myself up, but before I could, the creature let out another deafening roar. The sound tore through the night, a high-pitched screech that pierced my ears and rattled my brain. It was unbearable. The sheer volume of it sent me to my knees, hands clamped over my ears as I cried out in pain, trying to block it out. My head throbbed, my vision blurred, and the world spun around me. I could feel the Wendigo's rage, its hatred in that scream, and it was driving me to the brink of madness. I was helpless, vulnerable, and the Wendigo was closing in. As I knelt there, ears ringing from the creature's horrific screech, a thought broke through the haze of pain. My flare gun. I had always packed it for emergencies, a last resort. This was beyond any emergency I'd ever imagined. The Wendigo was closing in, its twisted form looming over me, ready to strike again. Desperately, I scrambled for my bag, fingers shaking as I fumbled with the zipper. The creature's footsteps were heavy, growing closer with each agonizing second. Finally, I grabbed hold of the flare gun, yanking it free. My heart raced as I cocked the hammer back, my vision still swimming as I raised the flare gun with trembling hands. The Wendigo's glowing eyes locked onto mine, and I could feel its malice, its hunger bearing down on me. Without hesitation, I pulled the trigger. The flare shot out with a blinding flash, filling the night with a brilliant red-orange glow. The world around me lit up in an instant. Every tree, every snow-covered branch illuminated in the harsh, fiery light. The flare struck the creature square in the chest, embedding itself next to my knife. For a split second, the Wendigo stood frozen, its skeletal form outlined in the intense light. Then, it screeched again, an ear-piercing, guttural wail that shook the very ground beneath me. The flare burned fiercely, sending plumes of smoke curling up from its chest as the creature thrashed in agony. Its movements became frantic, wild, as it staggered backward, clawing at the burning flare lodged in its flesh. I watched breathless as the Wendigo turned and bolted into the forest, retreating into the dark wilderness from where it had come. The fiery glow of the flare flickered through the trees as the creature vanished into the night, my knife still embedded in its chest. Its howls echoed in the distance, growing fainter and fainter until, finally, there was nothing. I collapsed to the ground, my body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The creature had retreated into the forest, but I couldn't waste a second. Pain shot through my body with every step as I forced myself to run. My lungs burned, and my ribs throbbed from the impact of the Wendigo's earlier strike, but the adrenaline kept me moving. The woods blurred around me as I sprinted toward my truck, each breath sharp and ragged in the freezing air. I burst out onto the trail, barely keeping my footing on the icy ground. My truck was just ahead, its shape almost surreal in the moonlight. I stumbled toward it, wrenching the door open and collapsing into the driver's seat. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for the keys, and when I turned the ignition, the engine sputtered and groaned, refusing to catch. "Come on, come on!" I muttered, panic rising in my chest. My heart pounded in my ears as I glanced frantically at the surrounding forest, half expecting the Wendigo to burst from the trees at any second. Finally, with a rough cough, the engine roared to life. I slammed the truck into drive, but just as I pressed the gas, I heard something, the same sickening screech from before. I whipped my head around, and my blood ran cold. The Wendigo was right outside my window. Before I could react, its bony hand smashed through the glass, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. The freezing night air rushed in as its claws raked across my face. The pain was immediate and excruciating, a burning sting that cut deep into my skin. It was like its touch carried fire, searing my flesh. I screamed in agonizing pain. For a moment, I thought it had me, its long fingers digging into my flesh, but I hit the gas, the tires spinning in the snow before catching. The truck lurched forward, and I felt the Wendigo's grip slip as it tumbled away from the window, screeching as I sped down the icy road. The cold air howled through the broken window, biting into my skin like needles, but I kept my foot down on the accelerator. My breath came out in desperate, ragged gasps, my face throbbing from the Wendigo's attack. I glanced into the rearview mirror and saw it, a tall, dark silhouette, its glowing eyes locked onto me as it gave chase, its form unnatural, and terrifying in the moonlight. It was fast, too fast, but as I pushed the truck harder, I could see the distance between us grow. Slowly, inch by inch, the Wendigo faded into the dark, its silhouette disappearing into the snowy wilderness. But I didn't slow down, not until I knew I was miles away. For weeks after that night, sleep had been elusive. Even when exhaustion finally pulled me under, the nightmares always dragged me back into the cold, haunted wilderness. My ribs, fractured from the creature's vicious strike, ached constantly. I hadn't even realized how badly I'd been hurt until I made it home. The adrenaline, the need to survive, it had all numbed the pain until I collapsed in my driveway. Now, my body bore the scars of that encounter. 3 long, jagged lines across my face, a permanent reminder of the Wendigo's claws. Every time I looked in the mirror, I was forced to relive that night, the night I came face to face with a legend. People had asked about the scars, and I always gave them the same answer: a bear attack. It was easier that way, easier than trying to explain what had really happened. Who would believe me? Tonight, though, the warmth of my home did little to soothe my nerves. Even surrounded by safety, I couldn't shake the lingering dread. It clung to me, a constant shadow, always waiting. Then it came, a sound in the dead of night, cutting through the silence with chilling clarity. A loud, screeching wail, unnatural, piercing. I shot up in bed, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was distant, but unmistakable. It was the same wail that had shattered the night in Algonquin. My heart raced as I sat there listening. The creature, whatever it was, it had found me. The Wendigo was still out there. Thanks a lot for watching the video. Till the end, subscribe to Horror in Detail for more videos. Drop your suggestions in comment section.